In Kansas, too many children still struggle to read at grade level. But the story isn't just about struggling students. It's about the systems, the programs, and the leaders shaping how reading is taught. I'm Jesica Glover, and this is My Child Can't Read, a Heartland Crisis, a documentary-style podcast about how students are left behind and what can be done to help them. In this season, called The Anatomy of Change, we take a look inside teacher preparation programs, classrooms, and among state-level leaders directing the future of literacy in Kansas. We talk with educators, parents, and experts about what works, from evidence-based curriculum and teacher training to coaching and assessment. You'll hear stories of students who found their footing when instruction finally matched the science of reading, and the systemic barriers that still hold too many kids back. Change isn't easy, and it doesn't happen overnight, but it is happening in Kansas and across the nation. And in this season, we'll show you how, why, and who is leading the charge. This is a story about systems, science, and people refusing to accept failure as the status quo. Because all our kids deserve to read, understand, and thrive right here in the Heartland.
Back then, I knew about phonics. I did not know about phonemic awareness. I did not learn that until I taught virtual kindergarten in 2020. I knew there was something else that needed to happen. I'm also the mom of 5 kids. And as a parent, I started to notice that there's a huge difference between the foundation my kids got in language in general, in the Montessori approach, than I was giving my kids in the public school. At that time, it was like 2016 to 2020, and it was very much whole language approach. But I had some systematic training before I came there. So in the parts where I didn't think it worked, I would always adapt and do it my way. Now, I was in a school that allowed me to do that as long as my results were good for that. I'm so extremely thankful. I always worked out what worked for kids, especially in teaching reading and writing. But now I've been, trained and I know the difference. I hate to say it, sometimes people in education go for what's cutesy and popular, but necessarily that is not what the kid needs. But I didn't find out about the science of reading research until COVID.
If we know how kids learn to read, really learn to read, why are so many schools still doing it wrong? Across the country and right here in Kansas, too many kids are being taught to guess at words, look at pictures, or memorize shape patterns, instead of learning to decode with the building blocks of language, phonics. The result? 2/3, or 68% of American fourth graders can't read proficiently according to the 2024 NAEP scores, also known as the nation's report card. And in Kansas, this already low rate is even more dismal. 72% of our fourth graders in our state are not reading proficiently. But here's the hopeful part. We do know how to fix it. Today, we're digging into why phonics has been left out of so many classrooms and what needs to change to put evidence-based reading instruction in every school. Phonics 101, what it is, why it matters. Let's start with the basics. Phonics is the method of teaching reading by helping children understand the relationships between letters and sounds, what educators call grapheme-phoneme correspondence. Dr. Louisa Moats has famously said, teaching reading is rocket science. And for good reason. It's a complex process rooted in brain development and linguistic structure. Dr. Moats is one of the lead architects of LETRS, the professional development program now used statewide in Kansas to train teachers in the science of reading. In this next clip, she breaks down why phonics instruction often doesn't work if teachers don't have the right materials, support, or understanding of how children actually learn to read.
They often have to work with instructional materials that are poorly designed or that don't have the components that we know help children learn to read. And often they have to work in contexts where there's just simply not the leadership and not the coherent policies that help teachers do the job that has to be done. The most common confusion is that if the alphabet is taught, the teacher thinks that that's phonemic awareness, or if just rhyming and alliteration are taught, that that's enough phonemic awareness. So a lot of children can come to using letters without fully understanding the alphabetic principle, what those letters do. And until we spend time making sure that the children are attaching those letters to these speech sounds in words, the phonics instruction doesn't work very well.
When children learn phonics systematically and explicitly, meaning they're directly taught the sounds that letters and combinations of letters make, the results are undeniable. In 2000, the National Reading Panel concluded that systematic phonics instruction significantly improves reading outcomes, especially for young learners and struggling readers. Dr. G. Reed Lyon is one of the leading voices in the science of reading. A neuropsychologist by training, he served as chief of the Child Development and Behavior Branch at the National Institutes of Health, where from 1992 to 2005, he directed groundbreaking national research on how children learn to read and why some struggle. His work helped define dyslexia, bridge research to classroom practice, and shape federal education policy. At the time of this clip, September 2002, Dr. Reed Lyon was also serving as a senior advisor on education to President George W. Bush. Here, he's speaking on C-SPAN about the Reading First initiative, stressing that while phonics is essential, it cannot stand alone. Effective reading instruction must also integrate phonemic awareness, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. Together, these make up the science of reading, a body of research showing how the brain actually learns to read. First, by hearing the sounds in words, phonemic awareness, then connecting those sounds to letters, phonics, practicing until reading is accurate and automatic, fluency, and building vocabulary and knowledge so students can comprehend, remember, and write. In short, it's teaching kids both the skills to read the words and the tools to make meaning from them. And the challenge Dr. Lyon named then is the one we still face now. Too many districts, including here in Kansas, continue investing in curricula that ignore the science, while teaching preparation programs often fail to equip new educators with the tools they actually need in the classroom. Let's listen.
In order for kids to learn to read, phonics is one critical, absolutely necessary component of learning how to read, but indeed in no way sufficient. In order to learn to read, kids have to learn about the sound structure of their language, about phonics, which is not the same thing, about how to apply phonics skills and what's called phonemic awareness very rapidly to text. They have to develop vocabulary so as they're reading they can understand what the heck they read. And they have to apply very direct comprehension strategies. They have to summarize what they're reading as they go along. They need to predict what may come next to really engage that text. You cannot pull any one component out and expect a kid to be able to learn to read effectively. It is an integrated, complex complex process, phonics being one critical part. But if that is all that is taught, then we're going to have significant problems, and we're not going to see kids moving to where we know they can.
Dr. Lyon's work builds on findings from the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development's National Reading Panel, which reviewed decades of research and found that the most effective reading instruction combines explicit phonemic awareness, systematic phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. These are the building blocks proven to help most children learn to read, not in theory, but in classroom outcomes. Yet here in Kansas, and in many educator preparation programs across the country, teacher prep has often emphasized reading recovery or balanced literacy approaches without giving enough weight to those core components. Teachers weren't taught phonics explicitly, and parents didn't understand that these building blocks are essential until those beliefs began to collide with what the science shows. And that collision isn't just abstract, it's personal. For many, it meant stepping into classrooms without the tools to teach reading. For others, like Diane Lyon, it meant struggling as a child and turning that experience into a lifelong mission to ensure no one else is left behind. To tell us more, here's Janine Phillips introducing Diane Lyon.
I first met Diane at a dyslexia conference, and we were immediately good friends upon meeting each other, very much alike. What struck me immediately was her passion, incredible passion, for making sure every child has the chance to read, or her ability to connect research with lived experience. Diane has a unique perspective because she learned to read later in life, and that journey fuels her mission to make sure no child is left behind. She knows firsthand what it feels like to struggle. The guessing, the shame, the feeling that everyone else is moving ahead while you're stuck behind. That lived experience is what gives her voice such power in the literacy movement. Alongside her husband, Dr. Reed Lyon, a neuropsychologist who led groundbreaking research at NICHD and helped shape what we know today about the brain and how it learns to read, Diane has been at the center of this work for decades. Together, they run Lyon Literacy Education Consulting and partner with groups like STARS, Parents for Reading Justice, and the Reading League to help bring the science of reading into practice. But what I most appreciate about Diane is her enthusiasm for talking about those she's worked with, as she's encouraged so many parents and educators, and as she's gone along on her path and has built communities around literacy, or how she inspires all educators, no matter what area they fall in related to literacy. She adds a voice of compassion and clarity that we desperately need today if we want to see our literacy scores improve. That's why I'm so grateful she's joining us today and throughout this season 2, Anatomy of Change, to share her story, her perspective on the literacy crisis we're facing as a nation, and her hope for a future where every child can read.
The 5 essential components of reading are phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. These skills build on each other to create a proficient reader. They are all essential. I know firsthand what it feels like when those components are missing. The guessing, the shame, the feeling that everyone else is reading to learn, while others are stuck on just one word. Without explicit reading instruction, children will experience the confusion and defeat that I did as a child.
The balanced literacy hangover. To understand how we got here, we have to look back. In the 1980s and 90s, a philosophy called whole language swept through teacher prep programs and elementary schools across the U.S. Instead of teaching kids how to decode, Whole language emphasized reading as a natural process, learned through exposure to books and pictures and meaning making. It sounded nice, but there was one big problem. Reading isn't natural. Unlike speaking, we aren't born with brains that know how to read. It's a skill we have to be taught explicitly. Dr. Reed Lyon makes it clear, phonics is necessary, but it's just one piece of the bigger picture the science of reading lays out. Yet for decades, many schools leaned heavily into whole language, which, as Dr. Lyon himself has said, isn't really a method at all, but a philosophy. A philosophy built on the belief that kids could simply absorb reading by being immersed in books and meaning making. The problem? It left out the very building blocks children actually need: phonemic awareness, systematic phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension, the components that make reading possible in the first place.
Whole language is not a method. It's more a philosophy of teaching reading. It burgeoned in the last 20 years based upon a philosophical idea that children learn to read naturally, that you do not have to teach them the fundamental skills that you and I have been talking about. That is, you immerse or bathe the kids in rich, authentic literature. You read to kids a lot. You get them interested in text and books, and they'll pick up all of the little skills according to the philosophy as they go along. Nothing could be further from what the evidence tells us. Reading is a skill. It doesn't come about naturally. When you have kids coming into kindergarten and first grade who read well and seem to have picked that up on their own, when you study their moms and dads and the family interaction, these kids have been taught extremely well by being read to by parents and so forth. Reading's a skill, just like piano playing, just like any athletic skill. You got to learn a number of subcomponents. You got to put all of that together. You got to integrate what you've learned, and then you're going to be able to get it.
One of the most harmful myths of whole language was the idea that reading just happened naturally, and it doesn't. I lived that struggle. Reading is not something our brains are wired to do without instruction. That's why explicit, systematic teaching matters just so much.
Whole language didn't work, and eventually many schools moved to what was called balanced literacy, a kind of compromise between phonics and whole language. But in practice, it often leaned back toward the same ineffective strategies: word guessing, 3-cueing, and leveled readers that didn't support decoding.
Hello, I'm Kendra Heim. I am the Department Chair of Social Science and Education at WSU Tech, and I'm also the Director of the Paraeducator Program. At WSU Tech, we're teaching 2 of the courses that are here at Phillips Fundamental in part of the Paraeducator Program. My background is elementary school teacher as well as a K-12 principal for students with multi-handicaps. I started my career in Ohio quite a while back, teaching in a school for students with moderate to severe disabilities. That school didn't have a set curriculum, so it was really up to the teachers to create and adapt their materials to meet their students' needs. We had a very hands-on, individualized approach. After 2 years there, I transitioned to the public schools teaching 3rd grade. This was a very different experience. This school had a district curriculum coordinator who selected the standardized programs for all grades K-12. For the early grades, phonics was definitely emphasized, but the reading programs also pulled from a mixture of different methods, including guided reading, cueing strategies, phonics. So it wasn't one clear, consistent approach. It was more of a blend. When I became a principal, one of my first priorities was to bring in a structured reading program because up until that point, like I had said, the teachers were left on their own to piece together things to make a curriculum. At the time, the only program I knew very well was one that I had used with my 3rd graders that were currently on IEP. So we tried to implement that. It really became clear quite quickly that it wasn't a one-size-fits-all solution. Our teachers were still struggling because whole language or balanced literacy approaches, just didn't provide enough of the structure or clarity for how to reach students with such complex needs. And the biggest challenge was figuring out how to truly teach these students to read when the programs available were not designed with them in mind.
And what happened to students who struggled?
In our school, many of the students who struggled, unfortunately, they continued to struggle. Too often during our IEP meetings, the conclusion came up that they simply were not capable of learning to read due to the nature of their disabilities. But there were also other students that could have learned to read had we known about dyslexia. I know that now, and I've had to live with that, once I started here at Phillips and learning about alphabetic phonics. I wish I had known that then.
Yeah.
I really think we could have helped a lot of those students. They were so bright in so many other areas, and I could guarantee right now that if they had been tested, it would have come back that they were dyslexic.
Yeah.
And they should have never been identified as severe or moderate disabilities. So They didn't graduate with a diploma. Again, it was another case of all those students kind of like fell through the cracks.
Yeah.
And that's hard as an educator to admit to.
Yeah.
To be honest.
Joan Stambaugh is a veteran special education teacher and reading specialist who knows what happens when kids don't get the right instruction. She started out trained in phonics, but like so many teachers, was pushed into whole language and saw her students struggle. Joan, who later discovered she's dyslexic herself, has since made it her mission to make sure every child has the tools to read. Today, she serves as an assessment specialist at Phillips Fundamental Learning Center and is author of What's Right with Me? Hope for the Dyslexic. But back in Topeka, when she tried to use phonics, the rules tied her hands. Even bringing in her own materials, she couldn't give students enough time or consistency. The result was heartbreaking. Not because phonics didn't work, but because she wasn't allowed to fully use it. Let's hear Joan in her own words. When you moved to Topeka and were told whole language was the only way to go, how did that feel as someone who had already seen phonics work?
Well, to be honest, I was angry since I had already seen that alphabetic phonics and the right instruction does help them to learn and engages them more. And when I was not allowed to teach in that way, I had to actually sneak in my supplies. And I always felt like, was I going to get in trouble? Was I going to get fired? But I would try to bring that in, but because I just didn't have enough time with students, even with the little bit that I would try to bring in, it wasn't working. And the result is a lot of behavior problems. Kids, and this is normal, they're going to respond to when they have difficulty and they can't learn like they see their peers learning. They just either act out or become the class clown or skip class or get sick. So it was devastating to see what was happening to my students, and also realizing that most of them that I was working with, their struggles were due to dyslexia.
I should have been taught how to teach a child with a phonics-based program in college. Back in my day of going through college, it was never pursued, it was never mentioned. Phonics was actually a bad word. It was all about developing motivating centers for small groups of children who were expected to guide themselves through reading and math on their own. That's all we did, hours and hours of building centers. Phonics is an essential instruction for all children, as I've said in earlier episodes, especially those with dyslexia. I realized as I was going through my alphabetic phonics training in Dallas, Texas, to teach my dyslexic son, that the training was built on scientific knowledge coming out of the National Institutes of Health, or better known as NIH. I was shocked and thought, how could I not have known of 20 years, over a period of 20 years between going to college and needing to teach Cooper how to read, that this science existed. It made no sense because the NICHD started studying children with dyslexia in 1975. That was 2 years after I graduated from high school. And they began field studies in 1985. That was the year my son Cooper was born. And so really, it was mind-blowing. There is no excuse that my pre-service teaching program didn't include this reading research. I did not cross paths with the understanding that phonics was critical to teach children to learn to read, write, and spell until I received alphabetic phonics training in Dallas, Texas. I don't think I've ever met a teacher who didn't care and didn't want to teach a child to read. Many have simply never been taught how reading really works and how to use this research to improve their literacy instruction. It's time for that tide to change.
For decades, balanced literacy left teachers with a patchwork of methods that never gave kids what they truly needed. And we've heard the stories of how that played out. Students misunderstood, teachers frustrated, families left searching for answers. But here's the good news. Kansas is starting to change course. In 2024, lawmakers passed the Kansas Blueprint for Literacy, a sweeping reform that requires teacher prep programs and K-12 schools to align with the science of reading. That means structured literacy must be the foundation of instruction, while outdated methods like 3-cueing and visual memory are being phased out. The Kansas State Board of Education has also adopted a literacy framework that prohibits practices proven ineffective, and districts are now required to report on what materials they use. By July 2025, any curriculum that has leaned on these discredited strategies will no longer be allowed. This is a major shift, and it sets the stage for the heart of the problem we have to talk about next: curriculum and leadership. Because even with new laws and frameworks in place, the materials teachers are handed and the preparation they receive still make all the difference. A curriculum problem and a leadership one. Here's the thing. Teachers aren't to blame. They're doing the best they can with the training and the materials they've been given. The problem is systemic. Many of the most widely used reading programs, like Units of Study by Lucy Calkins, did not include systematic phonics instruction until major revisions were forced by parent and advocate pressure. And as of 2023, nearly half of U.S. teacher prep programs still did not adequately teach future educators about the science of reading. This reality is staggering considering that over 20 years ago, Dr. Ray Lyon was pleading with the universities of our nation about the need to adequately train our teachers to teach what the science has shown us. He emphasized in 2002 and still does today that the quality of teacher training is a key factor in student learning, and there is a gap between research and practice in this area still to this day. Kansas, we can do better.
There are a number of things the kids have to know. They're non-negotiable. They have to know the sounds of the language. That's a tough thing for a lot of kids. Why? Because you've got to place those sounds on top of the letter characters. You got to do that quickly. You got to develop vocabulary. You got to, again, induce good, strong reading comprehension strategies. We know that we can identify kids at 5 and 6 years of age who are going to be at risk in learning those kinds of things. And we also know from our intervention studies, our clinical trials, which methodologies are most beneficial for which kids. The teachers have to be provided that information. There is a continuing gap between what the scientific evidence shows and what our teachers are being prepared to teach.
Hi, my name is Tammy Coford. I graduated from a state college in 1989 with a bachelor's degree in elementary education. Then in 2023, I received my master's in adult education. When I was living in Texas in 1999, I took courses from the Scottish Rite Center, West Texas, and became a qualified instructor for academic language therapy. I am currently the Director of Teacher Training for Phillips Fundamental Learning Center and have worked the past 26 years training teachers to support students who struggle with dyslexia and other reading difficulties. Teachers aren't the enemy here. They're victims of insufficient training and misguided curricula that wasn't based on the science of reading. When we equip teachers with real knowledge about how the brain learns to read, they light up. You can see the shift in their classrooms almost immediately.
My name is Sarah Balzer. I've been in education for 17 years, and I've had the opportunity to teach in a really wide range of settings. I've taught 1st, 2nd, and 4th grades, served as a K-5 reading specialist, and worked as a district ESOL coordinator and district dyslexia specialist, supporting students from pre-K 3 through 12th grade. Now I run my own private practice where I offer reading therapy, stern math, and evaluations. And I'm exploring ways to support teachers through dyslexia training that goes beyond what programs like LETRS provide. The training that I received at Fundamental Learning Center really marked the beginning of a whole new journey for me. It was eye-opening. I realized that despite all my years in education, all the professional development meetings I had sat through, all of my college coursework, no one had taught me about these kids or how to help them. And when I think back to teaching before my training began at Fundamental, I know this maybe sounds a bit dramatic, but it feels like I was walking through a haze. And after this training, it just felt like suddenly everything came into focus. I finally could see these little humans for who they are and for what their needs were from me. And I could see their parents more clearly. I began to deeply value their insight. Since then, I have not stopped learning. I will admit that I am completely obsessed with all things reading instruction. Really, something that blows my mind still is that all of this incredible information, it's already out there. It's right within reach. It wasn't presented to me once in college or in my first 13 years of teaching, but it is literally right there in books, in podcasts, on websites. And I feel like the key is knowing that it exists and just diving in. There is never an end to how much you can learn.
Kansas State Department of Education now requires teacher preparation programs to include what research shows kids need to learn to read well. Since fall 2022, those programs have had to show how they teach not only phonics, how letters connect to sounds, but also phonemic awareness, hearing sounds in words, fluency, vocabulary, sentence and paragraph structure, and even how reading works in the brain. Programs must also assess whether teacher candidates actually understand these components according to the Kansas Education Framework for Literacy 2025 and related Kansas State Department of Education documents. Every program in the state has now turned in paperwork showing where they cover the science of reading. But here's the gap. Turning in forms isn't the same as preparing new teachers to use this knowledge with kids. Right now, Kansas doesn't have a statewide system to check whether pre-service teachers are actually applying these practices in their student teaching classrooms. On paper, colleges look compliant. In reality, parents and teachers know real change will take time and accountability that goes beyond the paperwork.
Hey, I'm Diane House. I am the PK-8 principal at Skyline Schools in rural Pratt County. I've been in education since 2000. I'm a K-State graduate from their education programs. And Skyline Schools is one of the remaining few districts in Kansas where we have from 3-year-olds to 18-year-olds in one building. It's pretty cool, and especially for this gal who grew up in the suburbs of Wichita, it's been a real blessing to watch kids develop from 3 to 18. We realized we had to retrain our entire staff. What we were doing wasn't aligned to the research, and it was hurting kids.
And it takes leadership to change that, from superintendents, school boards, and state education departments.
Turning the tide, what works? Across the country, we're seeing a clear pattern. When schools prioritize structured literacy, explicit phonics, regular use of student data, and strong teacher training, reading outcomes improve. Take North Carolina, for example. Kindergarten on-track rates jumped more than 20 points mid-year. In Alabama, the percentage of third graders reading at sufficient levels rose 8 points in just 1 year. And in Tennessee, Indiana, and Mississippi all reported measurable gains tied to focused early literacy strategies. These aren't small changes. They're real measurable improvements happening quickly. But it's important to remember the nuances. These gains usually come from comprehensive strategies, curriculum updates, sustained teacher professional development, and data-driven instruction. Metrics vary. Some reports use percentage points, others scale scores, and some focus on growth mid-year rather than end-of-year proficiency. While these results are promising, they don't represent a complete solution. They do, however, show what's possible when schools intentionally align with the science of reading. Closer to home, schools in Kansas are beginning to follow suit, adopting structured literacy programs, offering LETRS training, and using data to drive instruction.
How can teachers, parents, and school leaders work together to ensure all students get the instruction they need?
Well, collaboration between teachers, parents, and school leaders is absolutely critical if we want all students to get the instruction they need. The truth is, it can be difficult to align everyone with federal policy, state mandates, and local schools. They don't always move in the same direction and at the same time. I feel like Kansas is on the right path. The legislation around the science of reading and the list of approved tools for schools has been a big step forward. And even something as fundamental as officially recognizing dyslexia as a diagnosis has been huge, because once students are identified, we can start getting them the right kind of instruction. The more we continue to bridge those pieces, policy, practice, and parent involvement, closer we get to making sure no student slips through the cracks again.
Today I have with me John Rolfe. And John, I want to start out. Could you start by introducing yourself to our listeners, your role as an entrepreneur here in Wichita, and your time serving on the Kansas Board of Regents, and of course your role as a dad?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. So I am CEO of Thrive Restaurant Group. We have about 200 restaurants across 20 states, about 8,000 employees. You'd know brands like Applebee's, Homegrown, Carlos O'Kelly's, Modern Market, and Qdoba. Those are the brands we operate. And I just finished a 6-year stint on the Kansas Board of Regents. 2 years as vice chair, 2 years as chair on there. So the last 4 years in leadership. And then I'm a father of 6.
Why do you think Kansas schools and schools nationally have been so slow to adopt phonics and structured literacy despite decades of evidence?
Yeah, so change is hard. It's hard in our own personal lives, and it's super hard organizationally. And the bigger an organization is, it's hard to turn. So when you think about education in Kansas, it's bigger than the, a cruise ship that takes, miles to make a left turn versus a speedboat. What I found, so we have 200 restaurants, like I said earlier. When we want to bring change, we say, hey, who's up for trying this change out first? We let people self-select in at an individual store level. And then we can take their successes and share that with everybody else, who then can come in and participate after that because there's proven success. When you think about the structure of Kansas education for public education, it's very bifurcated about where decision rights are, right? So the legislature's got funding opportunities. The governor has their own opportunities in who they appoint to the different positions. And what they are saying from their bully pulpit is important education. And then you have local control, all those local school boards and elections that go into that. And then you have administrative level, and then you have teachers who are with the students. And so when you think about change, even an organization like mine, where like I'm clearly the guy in charge, I can say, hey, we need to do this. And if I just say it and push it in, the take rate's not always going to be high across the 200 restaurants because John said so. Well, tell me why. Help me understand before I'm going to really apply myself to this. Mm-hmm. And so I think, real change is going to happen when you get that alignment, and but it's going to have to start really more at the ground level when people go to their school district and say, hey, this has to be important in our school district. Yeah. And as that school district experiences success, they share it with other school districts. Social change like this is slow, it's hard. And what's hard about this one is more kids get left behind every year. And so, there has to be impetus on this. The other thing I'd say that we've learned in our organization too, if we want to make change more quickly and from a higher level, is there has to be a shared agreement that change is necessary. Mm-hmm. When you have agreement out there that change is necessary, you don't have to spend a lot of energy selling that the change is necessary. You can start talking about what change you want to bring to the situation. Yeah. And so what I've seen is generally people out there believe change is necessary, but they don't have a lot of agreement on what it is. And what I've found, from my position on the Regents trying to bring change where we could, is that this is a situation where everybody generally wants to blame someone else versus taking their own responsibility. Mm-hmm. For example, what we had to deal with in higher education was, we had school districts pointing saying, you're sending us teachers that aren't trained in structured literacy. You're not putting enough emphasis on that. And so we had to sit there and say, okay, well, let's look at our curriculum. How do we need to change it? And this is all part of the blueprint for literacy that we rolled out a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. We got the deans involved and got them believing, to varying degrees, depending on the college, of what needed to change and how they could change their curriculum. But professors, they look back and they say, hey, I got a PhD and I've been teaching teachers for the last 20 years. You think I need to go get retrained again? Yeah. Look at what's going on in the school districts. That's where the problem is. Mm-hmm. And the age old inside of this is, the fourth grade teachers blame the third grade teachers when the kid can't read. Third grade teachers are blaming the second grade teachers when the kid shows up and can't read, and so on and so forth all the way down. And so it's just easier to say, if I got sent a better kid, whether, the family intervened more or the teacher they had before or my administrators brought more help. But what really has to happen, where I've seen real change happen in school districts and schools, is when someone looks in the mirror, whether it's the teacher, administrator, someone on a board, sits there and says, okay, what can I do? Yeah. What part do I control? First and foremost, myself. How do I educate myself? How do I share that with other people? How do I demonstrate what works? And how do I impact the kids that are touching me? When someone lights that internal fire in that way, it usually spreads in the team and culture that they're around. Yeah. And that's really, I think, where we're going to see the most profound change. But we do need structural change from the top, but it's been difficult to organize.
Yeah. It kind of reminds me of one of the terms we've been using on here, which, for lack of a better word, has been reading revival. Because we think about it in a faith term, stewarding revival actually happens in an individual first. They make a decision. So it's taking an accountability for where you're at. But if we're going to cause systemic change, it's also we have to start somewhere. Yep. The kid is either in third grade or fourth grade or another grade, but it's that teacher that has to make the choice to change for that group of kids. They're not going to be able to go back to first grade and start over again. And so, even you throw out LETRS, which is a great training program. It's not as well designed, I think, to give, specific, curriculum or changes, for the teacher once they get back to the classroom, but at least helps with their understanding. Yeah. But just rolling out a program like that does not mean that you're going to have change across the system. Some people just do it because they have to, they're required to, what are they getting out of it? And that, I really think that real change happens more locally. And like you said, right in the individual, and a reading revival has to start that way. And when you see the change, I think of one superintendent that I'm close to, when she saw the change,
The regret, she was listening to the Sold a Story podcast.
Okay.
And, had a long career at that point and realized that she had been a part of the problem. And, she was telling me that she was walking around her house cursing as she was listening to this thing.
Wow.
Like, how did I miss this?
Yeah.
And so it's an opportunity to sit back and say, okay, it's not quite working. Let's start with me. That's all we can control. There's things we can do at the state level. I mean, you can look at the Mississippi example and things that they did and how they coordinated. And that's for sure a part of it when you want to get it to the systemic level. But generally that starts when you have enough people that say it's going to start with me, the systemic change will follow.
What you can do. As Diane Lyons said near the beginning of this episode, phonics isn't optional. Without explicit phonics instruction, kids like me get left behind. And this isn't just her story. It applies to all children. For our dyslexic learners, who make up roughly 20% of Kansas classrooms, it's especially true. The evidence is clear. Change is possible, but only if we face the facts and put kids first. So what can you do? Parents, talk to your child's teacher, principal, local school board, and state board members. Ask what curriculum they are using and whether teachers receive structured literacy training. If your child is struggling with reading, don't wait. Connect with the Phillips Fundamental Learning Center for screening and support at funlearn.org. They offer diagnostic testing for students and training for parents so you can start helping your child at home today. If you're a teacher, enroll in the Science of Reading, aligned professional development, and ask your administrator to fund alphabetic phonics or other Orton-Gillingham-based training and coaching. And if you're listening from Kansas, remember, we can be the state that turns the tide. We can choose to stop guessing and start teaching every child to read. Because the science is clear, the time is now.
As a parent, I knew something was off, but I didn't know what to look for. Does your young child mix up sounds like saying "orf head" instead of "forehead"? Or struggle with crayons, scissors, or using a fork? Confuse up and down or left and right? Have trouble focusing on spoken instructions? Walk or talk later than the other kids? Skip instead of run or struggle with rhythm? Forget the order of steps? Miss 3-part directions by age 3? Have trouble reciting songs or nursery rhymes? Struggle to remember the days of the week? Get frequent ear infections? Or write their name but can't identify the letters in it? If 6 or more of these sound familiar, your child might be at risk for dyslexia. I called Phillips Fundamental Learning Center, and it changed everything. They understood, they helped. You'll be glad you called. I know I was. Call 316-684-7323 or visit funlearn.org today.
Thanks for joining us for Season 2, The Anatomy of Change on My Child Can't Read, a Heartland Crisis. Next time, we're going inside one of the most powerful literacy centers in the country, right here in Kansas, to see what's possible when schools align with the science of reading. Until then, remember, all children can learn to read when we teach them the code. Thanks for listening to My Child Can't Read, a Heartland Crisis. If today's episode resonated with you, if you saw yourself, your child, or your classroom in these stories, you're not alone. We believe every child can learn to read, and every parent and teacher deserves the knowledge to help them. I invite you to take action today by subscribing wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss an episode, rate and review to help others find this series, and tell us about your story and discover how the Phillips Fundamental Learning Center is changing lives through literacy at funlearn.org/podcast. That's funlearn.org/podcast. And share this show with a friend, teacher, or fellow parent who needs to hear it. All resources, source credits, and tools mentioned in this episode can be found in the show notes. Remember, together we can rewrite the story one reader at a time right here in the Heartland.